Welcome back to UbuConLA 2015. Up next, we have Elizabeth Crumbach-Joseph, who is going to present Building a Career in Free and Open Source Software. Elizabeth is going to talk about this. Now that major companies are using and supporting free and open source software, or FOSS, there are a lot of jobs available for people with a FOSS background. This talk will give an overview and valuable ways to contribute and how they relate to building a career in FOSS, and cover some of the benefits and opportunities related to developing a career in this area. Elizabeth Crumbach-Joseph is an automation and tools engineer at HP, working at the OpenStack infrastructure team. She is a member of the Ubuntu Community Council and the co-author of the 8th edition of the official Ubuntu book. At home, she serves on board of directors for Partamus.org, a nonprofit in the San Francisco Bay Area providing Linux-based computers to schools in need. So please give a warm welcome to Elizabeth Crumbach-Joseph.
Hola. That is all the Spanish I know. So I'm sorry, but we translated the slides into Spanish. So hopefully if you can't follow along with the English, you can understand the slides. Now I can change them. Okay. That's the right slide now. All right. So Jose gave an introduction of what I do and who I am. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about my work first. As a member of the infrastructure team for the OpenStack project, we pretty much make sure everything in the OpenStack project works for developers. So we run the code review system, the continuous integration system that tests all the code for OpenStack, and we're pretty much a team of systems administrators all over the world who are working to make sure OpenStack development can keep happening. Last year I worked actually with Jose on the official Ubuntu book, the 8th edition. So there are a few of us authors around here who are working on that book. I'm now working on my second book, which is going to be focused more on OpenStack rather than Ubuntu. But Ubuntu is still near and dear to my heart. I've been serving on the Ubuntu Community Council for 6 years now. That's an elected position in the Ubuntu community. It's the global governing body of the Ubuntu project for the community. There's also a technical board inside of Ubuntu, which works to make technical decisions inside the community. And then in 2012, I received an award from O'Reilly at OSCON for my open source contributions in Ubuntu. Those were all volunteer contributions, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I wasn't paid to do any of that work that I've done for Ubuntu, and I've been doing for about 9 years now. That is the right slide. All right. So here's sort of an outline of what I want to talk about today. Sort of explain how companies make money on open source. Try to convince you why you should work on open source. Talk about several of the things you can work on, because you don't actually need to be a programmer to work on open source. I'm not. And then the companies to look for if you're actually trying to find a job in the open source space. So the big question is, if you're giving away your software for free, how can you actually make money? This is a problem that companies have been looking into for a long time now. The first sort of idea that companies came up with is we can do training and support for our product. So we can have a company build open source, and then we can help people use it, train their engineers to use it, and that is the way we're going to make money. It turns out that's not a great way to earn money. There's only so many people you can train, there's only so much support you can do, and so much you can charge for that support. So while there are companies who are trying to do this and doing some of it, you don't actually see it all that much. What is much more common is having companies come in and do a deployment and then manage the deployment. So that's something we're seeing a lot in the OpenStack community, is companies who are coming into sometimes small, medium businesses and sometimes larger companies where they don't necessarily want to use the technical talent at their disposal to, say, run a cloud, which OpenStack builds. So they'll call a company like HP, where I work for, and they'll say, hey, can you come in and install our OpenStack cloud? And so HP will come in, we'll install it, and then we'll manage it for the company. And that's a very popular thing for companies to do, is this management of software that's been deployed as open source. They also sometimes add proprietary bits in there, so it may have an easier way for deployments of, Ubuntu deployments or things like OpenStack or other things. But the company essentially manages that. There's also something known as open source core. This is software projects like Elasticsearch and Puppet, if you've used the orchestration software for doing services. These have an open source core, so there's a community version. You can use it. It's perfectly fine. I use it every day. We only use the community version in the work I do. And then there is an enterprise version or a proprietary version, which adds a lot of special things for the software. So it'll have extra features. It may be gets updates faster, or other reasons why it's the enterprise version, but that's the version you pay for. So in the case of Elasticsearch, there are some security modifications and other features that come with that. Same goes for Puppet and other companies who are doing the open source core model. In the work that I do, we only use open source. Our entire infrastructure for OpenStack is open source, so I don't actually use any of these products myself, but they're definitely popular. And the companies that are doing this are doing quite well. So that's about how companies can make money. Why would you want to do this? Some people want to contribute to open source because they want to scratch their own itch, right? So you download this open source tool, you find it either has a bug that's really annoying to you or troublesome, or there's a feature that's lacking in the software that you really want to add. So typically what happens is people download the code and then they modify it, and then they're happily running it on their system for a year or so, and then a new version of the software comes out. What happens then is they download the new version, they realize that their bug still hasn't been fixed in the software, they just fixed it on their own computer. And now they need to rewrite the whole patch and put it on the new software, the new version of the software. And that's very unpleasant. Maintaining your own patch a long time over software releases is a lot of work. So this is the time when a lot of people either stop carrying their patch, I don't really need it, it's fine, or they contribute to the project itself. So you take your patch and you submit it to the upstream project. It gets accepted, and now you no longer have to worry about patching the software yourself. You now have it in the next download, in the next release, and you're happily now a contributor to open source, and you've helped yourself by including that software in it. And now it's sort of someone else's problem, because the open source project now has to test your patch every time. They need to maintain that patch in the release, and they need to make sure that everything is working, including your patch. Another reason some people get involved with open source is because they care about open source. This was a big one for me. When I started getting involved with Linux around 2002, it was because I wanted to customize my desktop. I wanted my desktop to work the way it did, the way I wanted to, and Windows wasn't really giving me that. So I switched to Linux, and I was using the Enlightenment desktop environment, and I was able to have a desktop that was completely free of icons. You couldn't see any, there was nothing on the desktop. You right-click for a menu. I used a lot of key bindings, but when my computer was at rest, all you saw was the desktop background, and that was the best for me. Like, I loved that. And I was able to do that with Linux. I was able to add different toolbars and do whatever I want. And these days I still use XFCE rather than Unity, just because I still want to do all the customizations there. And again, with an Ubuntu base for Xubuntu, I can use XFCE on top of Ubuntu, and it's it runs great, and I can change it if I want. But once I sort of got into using open source software, I realized that I was really had a passion for the ideas of freedom, and having the source code available to everyone, having anyone be able to tinker with it. And that's actually when I got involved with the Loco team. And we started putting Ubuntu-based desktops into adult learning centers, where I was living at the time in Philadelphia. And that was really exciting for me. We were able to help these learning centers that didn't have computers before. I mean, this is a major urban area without people with access to computers, which made me sad. But by using Ubuntu and donated machines, we were able to get computers to people who didn't have the resources. And this has always been super important to me. The equal access to technology all around the world is something I believe in and spend a lot of my time on. I also say it feels really good to share work you've been doing. I get to travel to conferences all over the world and talk about the work that I do in the OpenStack infrastructure. So every commit I make to our infrastructure is open source. We have a git.openstack.org that shows all of the code in the infrastructure, as well as all the code for OpenStack. And I get to tell everyone about that. I get to blog about it. I get to tweet about it. None of my work is secret. I can show every single line of code. Not the passwords, because that would be bad, but no SSH keys out there. But everything that's important is out there in the open, and it's exciting to talk about it. And it's really nice to be able to share that passion with other people I work with. We go to these OpenStack summits, and there used to be an Ubuntu summit every 6 months. And you get to work with people from lots of different companies from all over the world who are sharing your passion for open source and working on the same things you are. So as I was saying, you have an opportunity to work with people from around the world from lots of different companies. So I've had the opportunity to work with Jose and Pablo online through a lot of our Ubuntu stuff. And it's really exciting to be able to connect with people from different cultures, people speaking different languages. Hopefully they speak English like me so we can talk. But there's Google Translate. It's good. And then something that a lot of people end up getting from their opportunities with the work with Ubuntu and other open source projects is you get these opportunities to travel. I've seen Jose everywhere except for Peru until yesterday. He's traveled to a bunch of different conferences, and he's been sponsored to go to these conferences, and so have I. And that's because we volunteer with open source, we work with Ubuntu, I work with OpenStack, and through our work there, even when I was just a volunteer and wasn't paid to do this, I was able to get sponsorship to conferences. And there are a lot of opportunities out there, both for people who are really strong open source contributors and people who are minorities in technology, like women and people of color who want to go to conferences. There are always conference sponsorships available for people who wish to go. And then with what used to be the Ubuntu Summit and what I now go to is the OpenStack Summit, is through my work in OpenStack. I get to go to a different country every 6 months to meet with my colleagues in person. These are people not just at HP, but all the other companies I work with. The last one was in Vancouver, next one's going to be in Tokyo, and now my work sends me to all these conferences, which is pretty exciting. Another big reason people want to contribute to open source is getting to work on these really huge software projects that matter. I grabbed from Netcraft the July report. Just over half of the active websites in the world are using Apache. Apache is an open source project. When I want to tell people about open source, I sometimes tell them about Firefox because they know what Firefox is. Firefox is a very popular open source piece of software that people around the world use on their desktop, and they know what that name is. So I can say, well, you use Firefox. That's open source. and then I can talk about open source from there. But having one really popular open source piece of software is very helpful to explaining. And you can contribute to it because it's open source. They have a community, along with paid developers who work on Firefox and other tools in the Mozilla world. I also like to tell people that Linux pretty much powers the internet. It's the most popular operating system on the cloud by far. Ubuntu on AWS is the most popular Linux distribution that people are using there on Amazon, and it's running pretty much everything. Almost all the top supercomputers are running Linux. There are a few running Unix, and I think there's one running Windows. I don't really know how that works. It would probably run faster if it ran on Linux. But Linux is one of the projects that seems really intimidating and scary. But through some mentorship programs, they've actually increased the diversity in that community and made a lot of new contributors out of people who are very new to open source. So working on Linux kernel may seem scary and complicated and that you need to be a genius, but you don't actually. You do need to know how to program, and you need to be familiar with how systems work generally. But it's not actually impossible to contribute to the Linux kernel. And that is something that will then be deployed across millions of servers that run our world today. I'm going to double slide again. I know it. Hold on. All right. So one of the things that I've learned recently working on OpenStack and other parts of the open source community is that instead of trailing technology these days, you used to believe that open source would have a version of proprietary software. So you'd have a piece of proprietary software that everyone used, and then there was an open source version that was kind of trying to catch up. My favorite example of this is LibreOffice. So it was kind of a clone of Microsoft Office. It wanted to do the same things and take the same spot that Microsoft Office had. But these days, I quite like LibreOffice. I don't even know how to use Microsoft Office anymore. They've done strange things with menus, and I don't understand them. But LibreOffice, it's really solid. It's a good piece of software. So the software is now becoming more innovative. Pretty much when you're thinking about cloud stuff, I mentioned Linux. It's not largely open source. Amazon is proprietary, but at their base, they're using a lot of open source technologies. They're using Linux, they're using Zen, and a lot of open source products. And so if you think about it, a lot of the internet is built on open source. And the development practices used in these open source tools are also becoming more innovative as the software itself is. So you've got projects who are pioneering incremental changes to code. So sometimes when I consult with teams inside of HP who are interested in open sourcing a piece of software they're using, they tell me that they have this meeting, they write 5,000 lines of code for a feature, and then they dump that into their version control. So first of all, I'm excited that they're using version control. They're using SVN, but it's okay. But that's exciting. They're using version control, right? But they think that a 5,000-line patch is okay. Have you ever tried to review a 5,000-line patch? It's terrible. It's too long. You miss things. It's complicated. And then it lands, and it's totally broken, and the QA people start yelling at you. But in the open source world, a lot of the code review has changed from being these massive patches that land and do an entire feature to smaller incremental changes. And this has a lot of benefits. First of all, people actually review your code when it's not a 5,000-line patch. You have much higher quality control because people are able to take apart that piece of code and really look into it and find what it's doing and figure out if it's doing it wrong or if it's insanely architected. So this is something that open source pretty much pioneered because a lot of the people were working for different companies, some of the people were volunteers, and over time they only have time to review a certain number of patches. So they're going to review small ones, and so people sort of get used to doing small patches. And this is something that's been adopted inside of a lot of companies. I keep mentioning code review. That's something that not all open source projects strictly do. Sometimes there's just this team of people who commit code directly to the repository and no one has oversight over them. But it's becoming a lot more prominent. And this is important for us because as we start volunteering with open source or getting involved with open source, if we're not already using a code review system, we can get practice on using code review. We can get practice learning what continuous integration is and why it matters and how it can be used to do a lot of testing on our software. And you can do all of this from your home right now without having to apply for any job. The OpenStack community has a really amazing code review system. It uses Garrett, which is used by Google's Android development team, and is open sourced by Google. And then every time you upload a patch, it sends it off to our fleet of servers that will run all of the tests. So you can get experience with code review systems, with testing and all these things without having to pass an interview first. So then when you go for that interview, you can tell them you have experience. And companies actually do use these tools. They use Jenkins, which we use to run tests. Some of them use code review systems that are very similar to Garrett and have a lot of the same features. So companies are actually using this stuff inside their companies as well. So as I say, you start developing real-world experience even before you have a job. This is something that's really valuable for college students, people looking to make a change in their career, people who may have been stuck in a job that was not doing any sane software development practices, and now they're trying to get a job that's doing agile and all this continuous integration stuff, and you don't know what that is yet. You can volunteer with an open source project and get that experience. It's perfectly okay to put all of this stuff on your resume when you go to get a job. You can put your open source experience. I'd say pretty much half of my resume that I give to people is open source experience. Not stuff I was paid for strictly, stuff that I did voluntarily and worked on myself. Another thing that a lot of companies are looking for is really good communication skills in their engineers. This is something that I didn't see quite as much about a decade ago, but it's becoming increasingly important as teams are becoming more geographically dispersed, and just in general, people are valuing communication skills higher than pure technical skills. We want nice people working on our team who can communicate clearly and share their ideas clearly, and do that not just with people working in their office. And through my open source work, I've actually developed pretty good communication skills, and I've been able to work with people across different cultures. And as I say, that's a skill that a lot of companies really want to see. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time now on a couple of slides here about ways you can contribute to open source. One of the things I hear all the time is that I'm not a programmer, there's no way I can contribute to open source. And that makes me really sad because I'm not a programmer either. I can sort of make my way through a Python script. I did a lot of Perl back in my early systems administration days, and I can write bash scripts. But I write them all really badly, and I'm so glad we have a code review system because I can throw my really bad script up there. People can tell me what's wrong with it, and I can fix it, and then I can come out on the other end with something that resembles a real program. But I can't do it on my own. I'm not a programmer. I'm a systems person. I like putting together computers. I don't like writing the pieces that put together the computers. So the first thing I have on this list is programming, because it's obvious that for an open source project, you need people to actually write the open source project. You need people that are writing the code, you need people fixing bugs, you need to do all the things that have to be done reviewing code for a software project. But there are also things like software packaging. When you install a piece of software on Ubuntu, it's in the form of a .deb package. That package was put together through various configuration files inside the package by someone who was working on that package. Very early in my sysadmin days, probably 10 years ago, I started doing Debian packaging. So I had a couple, I think I still have one package in Debian. So I was doing this even though I'm not a programmer. You just take the software, you learn how it's built, and then you write sort of a script for it inside of Debian, the Debian package, and it builds your package. So software packaging, something you can do without being a programmer. It generally helps to reach out to the community when you do have problems. In my Debian packages, sometimes there would need to be a patch applied to the Debian package. Maybe it was a security update that hadn't hit that release yet or something. So I had developer friends who could help me if a patch needed to be written or something needed to be backported. But in general, you don't need to be a programmer to do this packaging. It's not easy, but you don't need to be a programmer. Another really important thing that you don't need to be a programmer for is generally working with bugs. So to fix a bug, you probably need to be a programmer. You need to understand what's going on with the underlying system, and you need to be able to write the code to actually fix what's going wrong. But there are all these bugs. I'll use Ubuntu again as an example. I think there's 50,000 new bugs in Launchpad for Ubuntu. These are bugs that are in the new state, which means they're not ready for a developer to look at them. Someone has submitted this bug, and now it's just sitting there. So we need people who are going to look at those new bugs and triage them, which means they look at the bug, they see if they can reproduce the bug, and if they can, then they reply to the bug. There's like a this bug affects me too option in the bug. And they can say, yes, this is me as well, which changes some of the metrics inside of Launchpad to increase the priority of that bug to developers. If you can't reproduce it, you may need more information from the person who submitted the bug. So you can change the status to needs information, and you can ask them what you need. You can say, I can't replicate this. You know, what version of the software are you using? What version of Ubuntu are you using? And there are scripts for all of this in the Ubuntu community if you look up bug triaging, for telling people, asking people what information is needed. This is something a newcomer to Ubuntu and open source contributions can do, because it just takes some time to look at the bug and try to replicate things and then ask some questions. It's important for newcomers also to be doing this and not developers, because developers don't really have time to be spending trying to replicate bugs and asking people simple questions about usage and how they made the bug. If the bug is presented to a developer with all the information needed and it's easy to replicate, they can spend their time on seeing that problem and fixing it, rather than having a long dialogue with the people who are submitting the bugs. So it makes the bugs get fixed faster, and it's much more efficient for developers if someone is helping them. Another big thing is documentation. Has anyone here used open source software with bad documentation? Yeah, there's a lot of bad documentation out there. And it's not bad because people don't care, it's just because a lot of developers aren't very good at writing documentation. So we need a lot of people who are good at writing documentation. And this is one that's really special to me because my first open source contribution was writing documentation. I was sitting in a chat channel for a piece of software that I used, and I've been sitting there for a couple of months not talking because I'm shy and I didn't want to say anything. I wasn't part of the community yet. But the lead developer one day complained that the walkthrough for the software was outdated, and he hates writing documentation and he doesn't want to update it. So I said to myself first, I can write documentation, how hard is that? Well, turns out it's hard, but I can do it. But the lead developer, so I said in channel, I said, hey, I can help out with that. And he's like, really? Yes, that's great, thank you. And first, I felt really happy. I was like, wow, someone's going to appreciate my work. That's great. And then I tried to write the documentation, and it was really hard, and it took me like 3 weeks. And I had to learn DocBook, which is an XML format that's really complicated. But I eventually got there, and I wrote the documentation. And I didn't know how to use version control at the time, because this is like 2004. This was long ago. I didn't know how to do any of that, so I just sent the document. I talked to the lead developer who was asking for it, and I said, how should I give this to you? And he's like, just email it to me. So I emailed it to him, and then he said, it looks good, and I was really excited and happy. And then when the next version of the software came out, my name was in the changelog. They said, Elizabeth updated the documentation. And I felt so good. It's really exciting. It feels really great when you make your first contribution, or when something is accepted of yours into a new project. I still feel that. Even though I work on open source every single day, when one of my patches is accepted to a new project, I'm so happy. I'll tweet about it. I'll tell everyone. I'm like, I got to change into Garrett. It was a one-line CSS change, but it's mine and it's in there. So documentation is a big one. We need more people doing it. So another thing that a lot of people don't really think about when contributing is support. Some of the companies that do open source, they do paid support and other things, but almost all open source projects also have a community-based support forum. This could be a mailing list, IRC channels for chat, various different kinds of forums. In the Ubuntu community, we've got ubuntuforums.org and askubuntu.com, and they're both sort of web-based forums. So whatever way you are most comfortable with interacting with users, there's typically a support outlet that you can go and interact with. One of my favorite things about support is that there is pretty much no time commitment at all. You can respond to a support request once a year, or you could do 7 a day. There's also not really a requirement that you know a lot. You can read through all the questions. If you don't know how to answer any of them that day, you don't have to answer any of them. But the next day, maybe there's a question you can answer. And then you can chime in and help with some of the easier answers, perhaps. Or if you're more focused on certain parts of the software or certain different areas, you can help only with that part. So maybe you're an expert in how to use all the features of LibreOffice. So when I ask a question, you can help me with that, and that would be great. So support is really important. It's what really makes Ubuntu a very strong community, I think, and made the software so popular. Even when I'm using Debian on my servers, I can usually find an answer about Ubuntu and sort of bring it back to Debian. But the Ubuntu community is huge, and there's support all over the web for Ubuntu, which is great. And that's been essential to having such a popular operating system. Another thing you can work on is testing and quality assurance. This one is very interesting. People don't think about it because in software, the QA people are kind of low on the totem pole and no one respects them. But open source projects actually do have testing and quality assurance things. One of my favorite parts about contributing to testing in Ubuntu is we do this ISO testing before a release every cycle. So you do it for pretty much 4 or 5 months before the release comes out. You download an ISO every day or once a week or once a month or whatever. You burn it to a USB stick, pop it in your computer, and do it like a live session, and you'll run through a series of tests. Or you actually install it on your hardware and run through a series of tests. But either way, you're doing a bunch of tests on your computer, and then you submit bug reports and you submit a test report to the testing community. And the really selfish thing about this is that I do this because once the Ubuntu version is released, my laptop works perfectly on Ubuntu. All the bugs have already been fixed because I reported them while it was in development. It's awesome. So testing quality assurance, it helps you and it helps the rest of the community, and we definitely need more people in the Ubuntu community doing testing. And of course, beyond Ubuntu as well. I mentioned OpenStack a lot, but we have a huge amount of testing that goes into OpenStack. We have automated tests that run, and we need people who are familiar with quality assurance to be able to evaluate the tests when they go wrong, and then look at the tests themselves to see if something has been written wrong with the test. Because if you start seeing code failing against a test and it's not the code, you might need to rewrite the test. So there's definitely a lot of need for quality, people with quality background to contribute to open source projects. And then what I do, I work on systems and infrastructure. So before I was working at HP, I was working at a small tech services provider. One of the things we did was provide DNS for some of the Ubuntu websites that I work on. So Ubuntu Pennsylvania, where I was living at the time, the company I worked for, we did the DNS for them. And then in the Ubuntu community itself, I run several of the US-based loco websites on a server that I run, and then I also have a server where community members can toss up web applications they're playing around with or testing. I can give shell accounts to users who want to stay on IRC 24 hours a day. Some of them just use this as a bouncer, so they can connect to the bouncer and see what they missed. Some of them are using other tools or just running a chat session on the server itself. But I wanted to provide this to the community because I saw that people were disconnecting and then they were missing things in channel and they'd have to go back and read the logs on the web, and it was all a big mess. So I'm running a bunch of servers for people in the community who need web services or connections to IRC or just shell accounts on a server if they're playing around with something. But beyond this, of course, my day job is working on the OpenStack infrastructure, so I'm now paid full-time to do systems and infrastructure on an open source project, which is super exciting to me because being paid is very nice because then I can eat and have a house. And actually tying into this testing and QA thing, there was recently a piece of the testing infrastructure that Canonical can no longer support for whatever reason. So there's a call out to the community to have the server will be provided, but they need people who are going to run the server, run Jenkins to do the tests, and then re-implement what had been run by Canonical previously. So in that case, they need QA people and they need systems people to make this project work. And that's something that you can help with if you're into systems or infrastructure or any of that. There's also things like working with the community. In my role in the Ubuntu Community Council, we do a lot of dispute resolution within the community. We do have a code of conduct, and people are generally nice to each other, but disputes do come up. We've had some with locos. You know about that. It's mostly just people who are working on different parts of the project, and they're all very passionate and very excited, but they can't all be the leader or other disputes that come up. We also work to engage with the community and Canonical. Sometimes the community members can't reach who they want to speak to at Canonical, so we can reach out to Mark Shuttleworth, who's on the community council with us, or other people inside Canonical, and put people in touch with the right people so they can get the answers that they need. So there's a lot of community work there. There's also things like event coordination. This event was put on by volunteers, so thanks to them. Very, very happy that they put this on. I live in San Francisco these days, in California, and we have a few events a year. We did a quality assurance jam, actually, earlier this year, where we brought people in with their laptops and gave them USB sticks with the latest daily image, and they all did testing, and I helped them submit bugs and other things. So event coordination, doing Ubuntu hours, hosting small events here and there. There's always need for that. Not just in Ubuntu, but a lot of open source projects have event coordinators who are running events for users and developers. Oops. So to get started working on open source, I suggest you grab a piece of software that you're already familiar with. Go to their website, find a link that says something like get involved or community or contribute. Follow that link. Maybe you want to sign up for the mailing list or join their chat channels. I tend to just sign up for everything because I want to get familiar with the project. So you can do all those things, and then you want to submit a patch or make a change to documentation or do a translation. Or if you already have the patch, you can just submit the patch and skip all the other stuff. Because some people don't want to get involved in the whole community. They just want to get their piece patch in. Some tips when you start contributing. I suggest strongly that you respect the work of people that come before you. Even if you join the project and the documentation is terrible and you want to fix it, I wouldn't start out by saying, this documentation is terrible, I want to fix it, because someone did actually write the documentation that is there. They may still be working on the project. They may be the lead developer who you really don't want to upset. So respect the work of people who came before you. And then if you make a commitment, even if you're a volunteer, I strongly suggest that either you follow through with the commitment, don't just say, oh, I'm a volunteer, it doesn't matter, or you explain why you can't. If you tell me that you can't fulfill something that you said you would, I will work with you again. If you just disappear and wander off forever, I will know that I probably can't trust you, and I'm not going to give you an important thing to work on anymore. So follow through with commitments, even if you're a volunteer, and if you can't, let the project know that you can't do it. And it's fine. We'll welcome you back next time. And it allows us to assign that work to someone else. I also tell people to avoid getting into flame wars on mailing lists. So don't start bickering with other people in the community just for fun. Be constructive with your comments and with your criticisms of the project, and be engaging with your fellow community members. And in general, just be nice to them. Also, I strongly suggest following the things put in place for contributions. So there may be a specific way that you're supposed to submit code. You can't just email it to the lead developer, because she may just ignore your email, or it gets lost in her email, or something happens and she's not going to look at it, because you're supposed to put it through code review, and everyone was going to review your code, and it goes through that. You don't just email it to someone. But in some projects, you do email it to someone. So you should look at what mechanisms for contributing exist and follow those. If you have trouble following those, you can ask someone in the project for help. Oftentimes, people will be happy to help you because they want new contributors. And if your question is just, how do I submit my code? How do I submit this documentation? How do I do a translation? Those are easy questions for people who are involved with the project, and they'll be happy to help you. I also strongly suggest collaborating with projects rather than forking them. Anyone can make a derivative of Ubuntu and call it My Linux, but you probably don't want to do that because it's really a lot of work to maintain a Linux distribution, and there's hundreds of people working on Ubuntu. If you count all the upstreams and other things, it's like thousands of people that go into making a Linux distribution. And you can't really do that yourself. So in general, it's much better to collaborate with a project rather than forking off on your own and doing your own thing. I also like to tell people to be visible in the communities that they work in. So you might want to maintain a blog or be active on social media. One of the things that I do with a lot of people is when I see someone has fixed a bug that was really irritating to me, I'll go and look up who fixed the bug, and I'll thank them on Twitter, and that surprises them, and they're all excited. They're like, oh, someone noticed I fixed a bug. I'm like, yes, now you're going to fix everything that's wrong with Shotwell, right? That didn't work, but it's really nice to be able to thank the people who are contributing and talk about your work in public and share what you're doing. If you fixed a bug report, you can say on Twitter, hey, I just fixed this bug. Hey, it's interesting and it's fun, and it lets people know that there's a process in place and they can work on it too. I also tell people to always say yes to interviews and speaking requests. If someone asks you to speak at a Linux users group, you should do it, even if you're shy and even if you don't really want to do it, or even if you don't want to be up on the stage. It's okay, but you should do it. Interviews are something that I didn't do for a long time as well because I didn't want to talk about myself. I didn't think I was interesting. But then I learned that I enjoy reading other people's interviews. So I thought, oh, well, I read them because it's about their work and I want to learn a little bit about that person. So maybe it's okay to do interviews. And since then I've said, yeah, it's totally okay. You should say yes to every interview that comes your way. You do have interesting things to say. Go to events and conferences. Congratulations, you're all here. And I say speak at events. I'm saying this again, and I want to add, because if you're shy, that's okay. I'm really shy. If I'm at a party, I'm like over at the wall playing with my phone and not talking to anyone because I'm shy and don't talk to anyone. But I like people. But when you're on stage and when you're a presenter, it's a totally different skill set. You may be scared at first, and it may take a lot of practice. But you know your role, and it's very clearly defined. When I'm at a party, I don't know how to say hello to people. It's a very complicated thing. And then even as you're a developer and very involved with the software, I encourage people to always engage with the users. It gets you to understand what their problems are and where they're finding pain points so you can help fix them. And it also makes you very prominent within the community as someone who will help and someone who may be hired. Because a lot of the people you may be helping in support forums are from companies, and they may say, hey, this person helped me on the forum, and she was amazing. We should hire her. So it can definitely lead to jobs if you're active inside of the community. And also be someone people want to work with. So you want to do, when you're working in open source, work openly with a public plan. So explain to people what you intend on doing, maybe have work items defined for your work there and say, these are the things I want to get done, and so people can help you. And if someone is already working on this and they haven't been open, they can be like, wait, I'm already working on that part of the documentation. I want to work with you on this. So just being open and doing all of that in public is very important. And work in a way that showcases your ability to collaborate with others by publishing a plan, interacting with people on the mailing list, and being very collaborative. And then it's important to take time to mentor other members of the project. So when newcomers come in, you should be that person who answers the question or who about how to contribute, or walk someone through their first contribution. It's really valuable for gaining new contributors, and it's very valuable to the new contributors, but it's also valuable to you. If you're a mentor, maybe you're looking for a job and one of your mentees is like, oh, we're hiring. And you're like, yes. And they can recommend you as a really awesome person in the community who's done a lot of good work. It also feels good to help people. And you feel really smart when you have an answer for someone, so that's fun. And finally, last bit here is when you're actually looking for a job in open source, there are a few different types of companies that you can look for. The most obvious are open source companies or open source core companies. These would be companies like Canonical, Red Hat, Puppet, Elastic, all these companies that have an open source core, and you see the name all over the place. So it's obvious to say, oh, I'm going to go work for one of these companies. And that's great. They are always hiring. They always need really great talent. So it's great to go and work for one of these companies. But they're not the only ones that are around. You also have companies, like the first company I worked with as a systems administrator, we used Debian on everything, and we used a lot of open source software. So my boss, every time we created a deb package, we would then evaluate the deb package and say, is this just for our company, or can we contribute this to Debian? And oftentimes we could contribute it to Debian, so I was able to get paid to work on Debian. And there's ways you can convince your boss to do this. If you're using a piece of software, or if you wrote that patch that you have to repatch every release, you can sort of convince your boss to let you contribute to open source, and that can be sort of a way to get in there. Or you can work for a big company or a nonprofit that may have something different in general than they're doing, but they may have an open source section. So I work for HP, obviously a giant company. We make printers and laptops and clouds, and I think we make like pens and stuff, I don't know. HP makes a lot of things, but I get to work in the open source division, so I only work on open source stuff, which is super exciting, and it's definitely a place that a lot of these really large companies have. And we're also always hiring, except we're not hiring right now because we have a hiring freeze until November, but in November we'll be hiring. And that was all I had. So if people have questions, Jose is going to help me. Ah, yes. That is the book we wrote. I think we're going to raffle a couple of these off. But yeah, this is the official Ubuntu book I wrote with Matthew Helmke, and then Jose and our friend Philip helped work on it as well.
Si alguien tuviera alguna pregunta para Elizabeth, la pueden hacer en inglés o en español, y si es que la hacen en español yo le voy a ayudar a traducirla para que pueda entender. ¿Alguna pregunta?
Don't be shy. Oh, there's one. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was talking about sort of shyness in general, and then also the apprehension that comes from submitting your code to a project, a new project, and having your first code commit out there for everyone on the internet to see. And you use the Linux kernel mailing list as an example. Some people, it's been known to write patches and have Linus say horrible things about their patch and their character and their mother. So it can sometimes be a tough environment. I'd say having a supportive group of peers helps a lot. So in the case of the Linux kernel, I mean, that one's a tough one because the community is a little bit hard. But if you have people review your code before making that contribution, you can have some level of confidence that it's actually good and you're not going to get insulted too much. I'd also recommend not starting there. I mean, some people do start with the Linux kernel, but you may want to start in a community that's more friendly, especially if you don't have that support group around you. And part of it really is just recognizing that everyone has that fear. Every single time I submit a new patch to a new piece of software, I'm like, oh no, they're all going to find out I don't know what I'm doing, and this patch is terrible, and it barely works. But it's just something you have to try to get over, and have friends to look it over for you too, and hopefully the community you're contributing to is going to be a supportive one. Hopefully that helps. We can chat later if you're curious.
¿Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más? ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta?
¿Qué le dirías a las mujeres para poder entrar a contribuir más a la comunidad de código abierto?
How could you encourage women to start contributing on open source projects?
So that's a good question. So the first thing I tell people is that you encourage them the same way you encourage everyone else. I wrote an article for opensource.com where I said it was 10 tips for girls, women, and everyone else. There are specific programs targeted towards both girls, who are younger women, and women, who are older, to help them start contributing to open source and technology in general. So I'd first start by encouraging women and girls to be involved with technology in general, just because there aren't that many. It varies by culture, but certainly where I am, there aren't very many. I'm the only root admin on my infrastructure team who's a woman right now. And I think there's 7 of us, so percentage-wise, that's not bad, but I'm still the only one. So first of all, getting them involved with technology, and then hooking them up with one of these women in tech or girls in tech groups. There's a project called Ubuntu Women, which isn't hugely active, but it is at least a community of women. There's an active IRC channel, there's a mailing list, and having that support of other women. I mean, I was never really the kind who felt I needed to be surrounded by women. I just kind of did my own thing and was happy to have all my colleagues as guys. But as the years have gone on, I realized I run into issues that the guys I work with don't run into, and I have concerns in my involvement that they don't share. So having other women to talk to has been super important to my involvement, and it's really kept me involved. So networking with other women, getting involved in technology in general, and bringing them to events. So if you have someone, a cousin or a sister or a girlfriend who's interested, bring them to events and try to get them interested, or if they're interested, they'll want to attend. And also in general, treating the women around you like they know something. I was at a conference and I went to a company booth and they asked me if I knew what open source software was, which is fine, even though it was an open source conference. But then they asked a guy walking up to the booth how he used their software. So I was like, really? You asked me the most fundamental, easy question anyway. It was not a way I appreciated being treated. So treat everyone you meet the same way. Like if you see a woman, don't assume that she doesn't know anything. She may be able to run circles around you with Linux, and most of them who are active in the community probably can actually.
So that's all we have time for now. So please give a round of applause to Elizabeth Kerpach-Joseph.